First I'd like to thank all you guys for coming. I know we have midterm, no one has work, so thanks for showing up. Because everyone's so busy and we always have work, I figured make a club to give students the opportunity to come learn about important global issues like climate change. So today we brought in Mr. Van Hook. He's going to be talking to us about climate change. And then this will be recorded and it'll be on World Global Impact. It's a website where we'll have the video, we'll have a blog, we'll have other important links you can read about global issues to learn about them. And you can go on there, you can comment on the blog, or you can just read what people have to say. Just inform yourselves. Mr. Van Hook was a professor at Columbia Law School, where he taught international environmental law. And he was also a speaker at the United Nations Institute for Research and Training. So he knows a lot about climate change, and you guys can learn a lot from it. So without any further ado,
all right. I am going to go fast because there's just a little bit of time, and we got a whole world worth of stuff that's fit into like 27 minutes. I am happy though. There was a lot of concern before that there were too many donuts, but that seems like that's not going to be a problem. So, all right. So, as he said, we're going to talk about climate change. So we're actually going to step back because climate change is an international environmental issue that fits into a context. So first of all, what is the environment? Who knows? What do you think of when you think of the environment?
Trees.
Nature.
Plants.
Grass. Animals.
Everything.
Air.
Maybe water,
The world.
air.
People.
Okay. And why is
Water.
it important to protect that?
It's where we live.
Everything.
Good. You know, it's like we love to breathe, we love to eat, we love to not die, exposed to stuff, and not only us, but everything else too. So it's kind of really important to protect it. So if it's important to protect it, we protect things by making laws. So why don't we just go down to the local, like legislature and say you've got to pass some laws to protect the environment? Why is that not enough? Yeah.
Because we're producing so much for the economy that cutting all the ways that we run businesses and cars and whatnot, it would be really detrimental to economies worldwide.
For there to be laws impact the economy, there's no doubt about it. But why can't we just make laws locally?
I think it's more than a local issue, it's a world issue, and if someone's doing something in another county or state, it's going to affect you in New Jersey.
Absolutely. Or another county, another state, or probably another country.
Okay.
So in other words, we make laws here. We know we've got the federal government, we've got the state, local governments. We make laws. This needs something else. This needs international law. This needs laws that are actually going to bind other countries. So, fine, we need international laws. Why don't we just go to the president of the world and say, guys, you have got to start passing some laws. Why don't we do that?
There's no president of the world.
There is no president of the world. Very good. Give that guy a donut. All right. So, if there's no president of the world, then you have to sort of say, well, okay, well, how do we make law globally? And this is a really important issue, particularly for you guys. Because we are, everyone says, oh, this generation is so important to that one, but it's just the same as before. This is a situation where it's simply not just as it was before. Ever since sort of the post-World War II era, a couple really important things have been happening. And again, it's going to really be important to you guys. First of all, population has increased very significantly, and each member of that population, each individual, consumes a lot more than they used to. So the overall impact on the environment has made our era what they have now termed the Anthropocene. It is that first era where it is the activities of man that are actually shaping our environment. And that simply has not occurred, prior to the 1940s, 1950s. So we are actually in an era now where how we make law around the environment has assumed an entirely new level of importance, because those laws are actually going to affect the environment that you live in a very important way. So then you say, well, okay, well then how do we make laws globally? Even though we've only been in the Anthropocene for about the last 60 years or so, our international law structure is basically based on a 17th century treaty, the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War and a bunch of other wars, which sometimes they call the 200 Years' War. But this treaty essentially laid out the basic principles of making law, and that is that every nation is sovereign, and international law can only be based on consent of the sovereigns. And that means that it's different from a national law where if enough people vote for it, 51%, you can get a law, and that can set the rules for what you're trying to do. On the global level, it has to be by consent of the sovereigns. And that actually creates a lot of challenges. You can think you probably have been in committees yourselves where you've tried to get consensus around what to do, and it's very hard. So it's a lot harder to make law on the international level than it is on the national level. So if that's how we're supposed to do this, then let's take a look at when the environment started to become a subject of international lawmaking. Really started out in 1972. We had what was called the Stockholm Convention, and this was the first time that the UN sponsored a convention around the environment. What was driving it there was acid rain. And acid rain is kind of that basic thing about international law. Acid rain, you discharge SO2 in one country, it goes up, it hits water in the atmosphere, and it comes back down as rain on another country. It's really like, you did it, I got hurt, we need a rule. As we progressed since 1972, we realized there's actually a lot of other reasons why we need to make rules in the international level for the environment. There's times when you can discharge something, it maybe doesn't go anywhere, but it actually affects the entire global ecosystem, and that's like climate change. Climate change is largely a matter of, does everyone know what causes climate change? Anthropogenic climate change is caused primarily by the discharge of what we call greenhouse gases. Primarily CO2, carbon dioxide, but also a lot of fluorinated gases, methane, some other gases. And we've known since the 19th century that these gases have a property of being able to absorb energy and then re-radiate it out in all directions. So when energy comes in from the sun, rather than being reflected back out to the atmosphere, some of it is trapped by these greenhouse gases and re-radiated back into our system. The cumulative impact of that is that the energy in our system continues to increase. That has a lot of impacts. One being that overall, that energy increases the temperature of our system overall. It doesn't mean that every day is going to be hotter than the last. It doesn't mean that heat is going to be equally distributed within the system, but it means that overall, the amount of energy trapped within that system is greater. It means that with that energy, you're going to have impacts on climate. You're going to retain moisture more than you did before with less energy in the atmosphere. You're also, with CO2, going to increase the absorption and the desorption of CO2 in water, which is going to form carbonic acid and decrease the pH, increase the acidity of the water. So a lot of impacts that come from our discharge of greenhouse gases over time. And again, more people using more stuff, there's a lot more of this, of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So this started to become, in people's consciousness in the 70s. What else was going on in the 70s on a global basis? What was the situation in the 70s on a global basis? Okay, we were just
Go ahead. Wasn't it the Cold War?
Well, it's a little bit, early-ish for the Cold War, but it was good. And I mean, that was certainly, post World War II certainly had, very strong. Certainly, the Cold War extended long beyond that. Yeah.
Increased oil prices is a big thing.
Absolutely. In the 70s, that from a geopolitical perspective, but also, have you heard about sort of like the post-colonial era? A lot in the 70s, 60s and 70s, a lot of previously colonized countries were just emerging from colonization or had just recently emerged from colonization. So you had a situation where the world really starts to say, we've got to start doing something about this. And you've got a lot of relatively new countries who were not too long ago dominated in a colonial structure. And now you have, again, Stockholm Conference, 1972, you have a lot of Northern Europeans saying, hey, we've got to go ahead and make rules on this. And the reaction was, well, we're not going to allow environmental laws assert a new kind of colonialism on developing countries. And this is an issue that pervades international environmental law, and it's really important for greenhouse gases in particular, because this kind of gets to the central issue on international environmental law, and that is this. Industrialized countries created a lot of pollution and generated a lot of wealth. These are the OECD countries, the westernized countries, sometimes they're called the North. So they have a certain amount of responsibility, and they also generated a lot of wealth in order to, as a result of that industrialization. Less developed countries didn't have industrialization, didn't generate as much pollution, and also didn't generate the wealth. Let's give you just some numbers for greenhouse gases in particular. According to the UN, the US is nearly 3 times as responsible for the current greenhouse gas or climate change impact as the entire Southeast Asia, including India. So the US is 3 times as responsible for current greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. One thing is, greenhouse gases can persist for centuries, some of them. So with the current loading on the atmosphere, the US is 3 times as responsible as it is for Southeast Asia, including Asia, and 2 times as responsible as all of Southeast Asia, East Asia, including China. So 3 times, often we talk about China and India as being major emitters, and they are. But again, this is the challenge. They are really big emitters now, but for what's currently out there, a lot of it really came from us, and we generated a lot of wealth from it. Another thing to think about is the per capita impact. Canada, the United States, and Russia emit more than 2 times the global average per person, and in India, they generate 1/3 the global average. Now, you guys are all math whiz. You know that if we're generating 2 times the average, and they're generating 1/3 the average, we're generating an awful lot more per capita than the average Indian. So you've got this unbalance. You've got this issue where we see that it's a big global issue. We want to do something about it. We also see that we're probably more responsible for it than a lot of the other countries. And we also have a lot of sensitivity in the developing countries that we can't let these new rules become a bar to them catching up to us on a development, on a development basis. So it's really, it's really a complex issue as you step into, okay, we're going to start doing something about this. So now let's talk about what did we start to do about it. As I said, we started to understand that greenhouse gases potentially had this impact back in the 19th century. The focus on it, the study of it, very typical for an environmental issue. Environmental issues are essentially science-based. They are about what is some sort of an impact that's occurring to our ecosystem, and what does the science tell us about what we should do about it. So throughout the 20th century, that knowledge was building and building, and finally we came together in 1992 and signed a treaty in Rio called the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is almost universally signed. That's another thing people say, oh, we've got to have an agreement about climate change. we have an agreement about climate change. We've had it for the last 27 years. It is almost universal. It's 197 parties right now. There are 195 countries actually in the world, but that also includes the EU as a separate party and some other organizations. I believe the Holy See actually. So what did this treaty do? This treaty tried to balance all of those concerns that we talked about. The unbalance in fairness in terms of who was responsible, the unbalance in who had the resources to do something about it. And at the end of the day, frankly, they really couldn't come up with a lot. So what they came up with was a generalized objective that said that we are going to all agree to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gases at a concentration level that's going to prevent harm. So very bland, and this is very typical of an international treaty. Because again, this is hard, and this is why you've got to start, thinking about, can we do it better? That's about all they came up with in '92. No firm targets. I was telling Matt earlier that I actually have a book on climate change that has to go to the publisher on April 30th, and so that's why I'm lacking a lot of sleep. But the reason I mentioned that is that for it, I interviewed a lot of the folks who were involved in the negotiations of the treaty. And let's just say the political backstory on these treaties is fascinating. We don't have time to get into it now, but let's just say that's all they could come up with. Hey, guys, let's try to limit ourselves to a level where we're not going to, cause huge harm. To a certain extent, they did that to punt it down the road. They said, we're going to set up some bodies under this treaty. You're going to keep thinking about it, and we'll try to come up with another plan. They came up with that next plan in 1997. You may have heard of the Kyoto Protocol. A protocol is a separate agreement under a broader agreement, basically. And the Kyoto Protocol, basically, what they did was they took that next step. They set actual targets, limits that the countries had to get to. However, if you think back to like the challenge that they're facing with this, unbalance in responsibility and resources, the way they tried to solve that is by separating out the countries. Annex 1 countries were developed countries, and non-Annex 1 countries were the non-developed countries. And essentially the targets only apply to the Annex 1 countries. And this has been, again, one of the really big challenges. In the United States, we're sort of saying, hey, now a lot of developed countries are starting to emit an awful lot. We get it, we've been doing it for a long time. We might be more responsible, but it's not okay that they don't have any limits at all. And this became the central challenge of solving this. And the challenge has become, currently insurmountable, because the Kyoto Protocol was signed by the Clinton administration. Everyone knows that Gore did not win, and Bush did. And soon after Bush took office, he rejected the Kyoto Protocol. And this is, again, one of the recurring challenges in international law. We get these countries in there, we say, guys, please agree to something. They spend 10, 15 years negotiating it away. An election happens, and boom, it basically disappears overnight. Now, one country pulling out doesn't eliminate the treaty, but the United States at the time was the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and the fact that they did not participate, and also when the big guy leaves, a bunch of other people say, hey, I'm going to go hang out with him, and Australia then quickly left. Canada pulled out for a while, so the U.S. pulling out of Kyoto basically sunk it. It still went forward, and we did some stuff. We could talk about that, but it basically sunk it. So we're kind of back to the drawing board. The thing that's on the table now is we're going to divide the countries, say developed ones have targets, undeveloped, or less developed, no targets. It didn't really work. It fell apart. So they get back in there and negotiating what could work, what could work, what could work. Comes up to Paris in 2015, Obama administration, they took a very different path. What they said was like, okay, now everybody's in, we're all in, but rather than setting targets that you're gonna have to negotiate in some little, in Paris, and then impose down on people, what we're gonna say is you're all in, but it's up to you to come up with targets and tell us what you're gonna do. And that was the compromise that came out of Paris, basically. And, it's kind of a, I'm simplifying so much, because there are more requirements on some, there's some questions around verification and things like that. But that was the grand compromise of Paris. But yet again, that was signed by the Obama administration, and then during the campaign, and finally when it was elected, it was rejected by the Trump administration. Technically, we're not out because it's a 3-year waiting period before you're out, but it has been rejected by the Trump administration. So there again, 97 to 2015, all that work, new election and overturned. So where we're at now, and again, I'm simplifying somewhat, but basically where we are at now is 27 years after the entire world said that climate change is a really big problem and we've got to do something about it, and where we are really seeing the impact significantly, 27 years later, we still do not have a regime that covers the major emitters of greenhouse gases. So, that's a challenge. That's a challenge. It's a challenge for us old folks, but it's a big challenge for you guys. And again, it's not that, we must have solved this at some point back in the 14th century. No, this is a new challenge, and it's something that you guys are going to have to try to figure out. And I will throw out a couple things. One, don't think that there is a system that has worked consistently and all we have to do is make sure everybody follows that system. So I say, there's a new challenge that you guys are gonna have to fix. There's a couple things that I, and other people smarter than me, think maybe are parts of it. One is what, there's a really great internationalist and negotiator who's been in and out of government named Moise Naim, and he comes up with this notion of the magic number. And that is that, I'll try to do this really quickly, but we had one really successful international environmental agreement, and that was the Montreal Protocol on ozone-depleting substances. That was signed by 30 people initially, is when it went into effect. Now it's got way more. I think it's got around 195 countries that have acceded to it now. 30 countries. It's a lot easier to make an agreement with 30 countries than it is with 197. Where I believe we took the wrong turn is we came off of Montreal and said, hey, we got this, we're gonna do this, everybody in, let's come up. That doesn't work. It's really, really hard to make an agreement with 197 different parties, most of whom, I hate to say it, but are completely irrelevant to the problem. There are about, like 20 countries that emit 95% of the greenhouse gases in the world. Let's throw in an extra, 10. And 30 countries, that brings you up to the number that initially ratified the Montreal Protocol. And Moise Naim says the magic number for negotiating is the least possible number that can make a material impact on the issue. And I think that that is one turn that the international community is going to have to take. We have to abandon this notion. I happen to be a representative at the climate negotiations. You go there, it is a circus. There are thousands and thousands of people there. And you say, this is not gonna work. So I think that's one shift that we're gonna take, is to say, let's focus on the people that really matter. Not because they're more important or better, but because they can actually impact the outcome and make a decision based on that. And the second thing that I think is important is, really important, and I want to sort of say it this way, I use this sort of as my proof. As I've said, there is no globally applicable agreement on climate change. You can debate that, is Paris will be, all that kind of stuff, but let's just face it, there's not. However, Honeywell and a lot of our peers, since 2004, we have inventoried our greenhouse gases, set targets to remove them, had our progress third-party verified, and we have reduced our greenhouse gas intensity by over 95%. Now, why? There is no international law. We start out by saying, hey, we need international laws. My proposition, and a lot of others, it's funny, I know some of you guys play rugby. There's a really great professor at Yale called Harold Coe who calls this, international law is now a rugby scrum. Because, you got the people negotiating in the UN, and you got all kinds of other stuff going on. NGOs taking action, industry taking action. It's all getting publicized through the public, the World Wide Web, and it's a very dynamic, I call it the governance ecosystem. And for some reason, if you just look empirically, Honeywell has reduced its greenhouse gases by 95%. That's the result of the ecosystem, not of negotiations in Paris or in Kyoto. And the reason why I think that's important is that, again, if you go back to the Treaty of Westphalia, states make international law. I think the second big recognition that people are going to have to come to is that it's not just about states anymore. A lot of non-state actors have much more significant international networks than the state actors. And they have the resources and the insights, and we could go on and on. If you've ever been to the UN, you know that I'd probably rather try to get something done by a large NGO or by a corporation than I would to try to get it done by the UN. It doesn't mean that the UN is valueless, but they need a recognition that the other stuff that's going on is going to be a powerful motivator of achieving their ends. So those are the three things I would just leave you with are: one, it is really important. It's a new challenge. It's going to be your challenge. Two, I think that this notion that everyone has to be in to solve these doesn't work. You got to get to that magic number, and that will work. And then last is, you got to realize it's not just about the states. It's about everything else. And when I say states, I mean nations. It's everything else that's going on, and you have to incorporate that. So, boom, I hit 10:30.
Thank you, Mr.
Speed
Van
talk.
Hook. I know you guys got to get to class, so hopefully I'll see everything you guys can do.